You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, editor-at-large at The Diplomat and the Stanton Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I'm glad to be joined today by a former colleague of mine at The Diplomat, a name that I'm sure will be very familiar to longtime readers and listeners of the podcast. Franz Stefan Gotti joins me today. Franz, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Ankit. I'm really glad to be back on the program. Great chatting with you.
Yeah, and I thought we could open by giving you an opportunity to tell listeners what you've been up to. You're now a research fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Tell us a little bit about the topics that you're currently working on pertaining to the future of war in Asia and elsewhere.
Sure, absolutely. So I joined the Institute for International Strategic Studies about a year and a half ago, and my focus is on cyberspace and future conflict, and especially the integration of those different dimensions, or also military capabilities in those dimensions, and trying to figure out how to best integrate kinetic, non-kinetic capabilities in future warfighting scenarios, and just generally think about emerging technologies and how they might impact future warfighting and future conflict. So I've been pretty busy the last year and a half, and I've been working on a couple of interesting research projects. And so I'm really happy that we can chat a little bit about this during our get-together today.
Yeah, and so, just for listeners, the reason that Franz is on the show today is actually to talk about a recently published chapter that he prepared for IISS, looking at the role that certain so-called emerging technologies might play in a Taiwan Strait contingency or conflict involving the United States and China primarily, but also the Taiwanese military directly. And so, Franz, I want to sort of go through some of the scenarios and the technologies that you sort of bring up in this excellent report. Let me begin by just reflecting a little bit, though. I mean, there are obviously talking about a Taiwan Strait conflict has become a very sort of common topic in Asian security and strategic circles, not only in Washington, but in Europe, at least in parts of Europe, and certainly in Asia over the last few years. There are uncertainties and certainties here, of course. The uncertainties, of course, I think pertain to how any future conflict might begin or how it might develop and how escalation might actually look in practice. Those things are practically unknowable until a conflict actually begins. But the certainties that we do have, and I think are useful to reflect on, are regarding, first of all, the strategic orientation of the People's Republic of China under Xi Jinping. I mean, Xi has made really no secret of the fact that unification with Taiwan continues to be a core strategic objective related to China's core national interests. China continues to see Taiwan as a part of its territory. And in the meantime, we've had a series of developments in Taiwan over the last decade plus, pointing in the direction of a new sort of a process of Taiwanization, where Taiwanese national identity is inherently becoming much more entrenched in terms of the identity of the island itself, and less with a broader Chinese identity. And combining sort of broader concerns about the U.S. military's ability to practice effective deterrence by denial in the Taiwan Strait, concerns continue to grow about this kind of conflict breaking out. We'll try to sort of steer clear of the political factors that might lead into a conflict and focus really on the military hardware, which is something that, I haven't done in a while on this podcast. And I'm actually really glad that we get to sort of geek out a little bit over some of these technologies and the roles that they might play. So Franz, I won't introduce the concepts, the scenarios that you describe, but maybe very quickly before we sort of delve into some of these issues, do you want to just walk us through the four primary scenarios that you explore in your chapter?
Sure. Just also very briefly, I agree wholeheartedly with what you just said, and I also just want to emphasize again that these scenarios are in no way ought to be predictive of any future conflict based on any sort of political analysis when it comes to China and the United States and China-Taiwan relations and so forth. I'm really merely using those scenarios to illustrate the character of future warfighting. So just to be clear on that. And so I essentially, in that chapter, which is, by the way, part of a larger publication called the Regional Security Assessment, which gets published by my company, the Institute for International Strategic Studies, once a year in the lead up to the Shangri-La Dialogue, which sadly was canceled this year. Hopefully, we'll be back next year in full form. In any case, so in my short chapter in that book, I'm focusing on 4 fictional war scenarios that are really just meant to showcase how emerging technological capabilities could be used in a future Sino-US military confrontation over Taiwan in around 2030 or in the 2030s, broadly speaking. And I have 2 scenarios that focus on the United States, where the United States is the principal actor, and then 2 scenarios that are more focused on China, with Chinese military commanders and forces as the main actors here. So my 2 US scenarios, I have one scenario where it is about the deployment of AI-enabled intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities to track Chinese mobile ballistic missile forces. That's one scenario. I have another scenario that's about AI-enabled offensive cyber capabilities that are used to degrade Chinese People's Liberation Army command and control communications. This actually leads to inadvertent nuclear escalation, as I describe it in my scenario, between nuclear and conventional command and control capabilities within the People's Liberation Army. And then I have 2 more China-focused, or 2 scenarios from the Chinese perspective. One is on hypersonics, where I essentially describe a scenario where the PLA, or the PLA rocket force rather, uses hypersonic missiles to target US naval strike groups beyond the first island chain. And then also one scenario where I'm talking about uninhabited systems, both in the air and underneath, like in the ocean. So that scenario pertains to the Chinese PLA employment of uninhabited aerial vehicles, or drones, as you can also call them, in the suppression of enemy air defense campaign over Taiwan. And then also a swarm of underwater drones or underwater unmanned vehicles targeting a US carrier strike group. So here it's really mostly about swarming and uninhabited systems. So these are my 4 scenarios, and then each scenario is accompanied by a section that really describes the current state of affairs when it comes to technological developments in 2021, when it comes to all the technological capabilities that are described here, and then also a section that goes beyond and just tries to beyond the United States and China, and tries to look at what other Asia Pacific countries are doing in those respective fields. But I think it's really important to me to emphasize the reason why I wrote this chapter is really to move away a little bit from this technological conversation, because whenever we think about future conflict, the first thing we think about are fancy new, or rather emerging technological capabilities that are going to alter the character of warfare. And my main point here, my main reason for writing this chapter is actually that I want to move away a little bit from this technological deterministic interpretation of future conflict, where I say it's an important component, of course, technology, but there are also other factors that perhaps even are sometimes more important, such as the right doctrine, getting the right doctrine, operating concepts, but also organizational structures and so forth. And then perhaps most importantly, and strangely often neglected, leadership, to what degree leadership can shape the character of future warfare.
I was just about to say, I mean, political leadership and decision-making are essential to the course of any future conflict. And I think, we know that from history. We know that from, sheer, strategic logic when we think about these scenarios. So I will sort of counsel listeners here, if any of those scenarios sounded interesting to you and you haven't yet read the chapter, I'd recommend that you pause the podcast, read the chapter, and then come back and hit play, because we're not going to go through the fine details. We just don't have enough time on the episode to talk through the those issues. But Franz, I was hoping that we could focus a little bit on sort of some higher order questions that sort of come out of some of the scenarios that you delve into. So, your first footnote, which I was very pleased to see, of course, notes that the definition of what is considered an emerging technology is very fuzzy. Those of us who reside in the think tank world, of course, are very familiar with, seeing this term sort of bandied about in papers. It's sort of a very kind of sexy thing to sort of present to prospective, I guess, funders, organizers, to say, hey, we're working on emerging technologies. This is all exciting and new and is going to totally revolutionize the nature of warfare and and human conflict. But when you sort of slow down and you sort of start thinking about some of these terms that get used, like hypersonic weapons, artificial intelligence, you begin to sort of realize, maybe, first of all, in some ways, these aren't necessarily emerging in quite the way that the term might sort of lead some people to think that it is, that, this is something that came out of nowhere in, let's say, 2017, 2018 or so. These are older terms. So I wanted to sort of, push you a little bit on that. AI is particularly prominent in the first two scenarios that you describe. And I was wondering if for our listeners, you could just kind of explain a little bit about what exactly artificial intelligence integration into intelligence surveillance reconnaissance or ISR or offensive cyber capabilities looks like in practice. Because, in some places you'll see folks, describe things that might be as rudimentary as, basic statistical analysis, which has been informing sort of military campaigns and warfighting going back to the second half of the 20th century or so, all the way to, more advanced machine learning techniques. And then, of course, there's the, Rocco's basilisk style general artificial intelligence, the kind that you see in science fiction films like The Matrix and so forth. So what exactly do we mean when we talk about artificial intelligence in the context of these specific capabilities on ISR and cyber in particular?
That's a really great question. I'm really glad that you ask it. So I guess in my scenario, first and foremost, when I talk about artificial intelligence, I'm really talking about essentially machine learning algorithms. So algorithms that are essentially using statistics to guess patterns in big data or massive amounts of data. And I think what's important to understand here is that machine learning generally can correlate data, but it cannot really infer causality. In other words, machine learning is all about correlation and not causation. And I think this is still a big problem when it comes to moving artificial intelligence. And I'm really not talking about these, like general AI or general artificial intelligence. I'm really talking about narrow artificial intelligence here. So not an omnipresent computer, sort of like we know from certain movies like Terminator and so forth, or 2001 Space Odyssey, right? I'm really talking about much more rudimentary systems here. And I think the problem here is that if the premise is that all these algorithms can only correlate data, and you can't really move from correlation to causation, you have an inherent explainability problem, as it is called, right? And once you have an explainability problem, because you can't really understand why your AI-enabled, let's say, decision support system offers you as a military commander with a certain option, a certain course of action in the middle of, let's say, a firefight or so, it's very difficult to actually trust the system. So I think there's still a big issue when it comes to trusting these systems. And so when I did my scenarios, so when I wrote my scenarios, I was very conscious of the fact that there is a trust system that has still not been resolved. And I think we need to overcome this trust deficit, so to speak, if we really are going to move into, in one scenario, I talk about AI-enabled battle management systems. And the United States Air Force and all the other service branches in the United States are already working on such systems. To what degree, though, it will actually have any real impact will be largely dependent upon whether military commanders are actually going to be willing to trust the system and its recommendations, right? Mm-hmm. So I think this is one of those technical stumbling blocks that we still will need to overcome. Having said that, it is possible. There are ways, there are projects, there's research being done that is being conducted specifically on this issue. And so my hypothesis for these scenarios is that it might be solved within the next decade. But having said that, of course, these are fictional scenarios, and I clearly outline also all the problems. And I think the other point was really crucial, that when you said that a lot of these technologies are really not revolutionary. And I would actually agree with you, because at the end of the day, yeah, statistical analysis or looking for statistical pattern in massive amounts of data, we've done this to a certain degree already for a long time. I think what's really revolutionary, or could potentially be revolutionary here and really important, is that what we are trying to do here in many ways is really accelerate the operational pace of military operations.
Yeah.
So we are trying to accelerate the so-called kill chain that is really linking shooters and sensors. And I think this actually could, in a way, revolutionize our way of conducting warfare, at least when it comes to speeding up operations. I'm not really saying that this is going to have a fantastic impact on future military operations in terms of making military or operations more decisive, but I do think it is fundamentally going to change the character of warfare, if that makes sense to you.
Absolutely. I mean, so, your point about the kill chain is a perfect segue into what I want to talk about next, which is sort of reflecting at the sort of political military dynamics in the Taiwan Strait that might lead up to a conflict, right? So you have, the broad picture here is that you have one party, People's Republic of China, interested in strategic revisionism, unifying Taiwan with China across the Taiwan Strait. You have the United States, which is fundamentally interested in preserving the status quo. And as a result, the core U.S. objective is deterring China from taking that action. So to deter China, the United States obviously relies on a core set of military capabilities in and around the region. In recent years, there's been a lot of commentary that U.S. capabilities are beginning to appear to be insufficient given China's rapid pace of military modernization and quantitative expansion of its military capabilities. So that sort of brings me to the point that you just made, because in effect, the way I sort of think about the challenge of deterrence in the Taiwan Strait for the United States is effectively what the U.S. is seeking to practice is deterrence by denial here, right? Deterrence by punishment, being sort of more familiar to those of us who spend time thinking about nuclear deterrence, is not really what the challenge in the Taiwan Strait is, right? If you're going to punish China with retaliation for invading Taiwan, you've already lost the political game because you've ceded Taiwan in the first place. So the task is to convey to China that the costs of invading Taiwan and carrying out a sustained campaign across the Taiwan Strait are so great that Xi Jinping simply should not bother. And so I think part of doing that, Franz, has to do with sort of ironing out and figuring out these sort of issues pertaining to the kill chain, particularly when it comes to integrating your sensors, informing, your shooters and your sensors are making sure that they're all interlinked and that they're able to hold the targets that they need to at risk. And on the flip side, China has, I think, similar incentives. I think you talked about this with your last two scenarios, right, in terms of degrading Taiwanese air defenses. This would be the core role for Chinese conventional precision strike systems, striking at sort of soft targets in Taiwan, suppression of enemy air defenses, and degrading command and control where appropriate. So tell us a little bit about, if you're sort of Xi Jinping and if you're, Joe Biden or whoever will be president of the United States in the 2030 timeframe that you're thinking about here, how do you sort of incorporate these technologies into the ways in which you practice deterrence? Because, fundamentally, I think what we're getting into here are, we're moving away from technological determinism and starting to get to some kind of political and psychological topics. I'm wondering how you think about that in the context of a potential future conflict in the Taiwan Strait.
Yes, that's a very tricky question, of course. My first reaction would be that perhaps we have to move away from this idea that has been prevalent for the last couple of decades, where we equate deterrence with presence, where essentially we have troops in the region that are meant to deter Chinese military aggression against Taiwan or any other allies and partners of the United States. Because when if we move away from the current force structure and really move to a much more network-centric force structure that's really largely dependent upon standoff, long-range precision strikes and so forth, those capabilities don't necessarily need to be in the region, right? If you look at the last National Defense Strategy, though, it clearly states that you need this so-called blunt layer, you need a forward deployed military presence, but the current disposition of military bases, those big bases are supposedly extremely vulnerable to Chinese precision strikes because we've entered this new era of a global precision strike regime, right, as it is called, as this proliferation of long-range precision strike capabilities has really taken place over the last decade. So it's a really interesting debate, and I think one would need to consider carefully what the trade-offs here are. And I think what's clear to me is that we need to move away perhaps from this concept of multi-purpose platforms such as the F-35, a very exquisite, very expensive weapon system that can really do a lot of things, but where there are very few platforms out there because what you said earlier, deterrence by denial, or this idea of deterring by denial, implies also that that your armed forces are willing to take punches and also are willing to get hit, which to me automatically means you need to have a force structure that's much more ready to accept a certain amount of attrition in a military conflict, or at least you want to signal your opponent that you're willing actually to engage in a war of attrition when it comes to certain scenarios, such as an invasion of Taiwan or a Chinese occupation of Taiwan. So I think the question then is, if we want to have if you want to have a joint force that's more attritable, so to speak, what does it really mean in terms of technologies, right? And this is, I think, where one of my scenarios are coming in, really, this idea of single-purpose platforms, unmanned, uninhabited systems, and so forth, whether they're on the ocean, in the ocean, or up in the air, or on land. I think this is really in the back of all of this reorganizing of the U.S. armed forces.
So I think everything that you just said makes a ton of sense, and particularly in terms of what you said about attrition. I mean, that's why I think we see this big focus on resiliency right now in the United States, right? Ensuring that, sort of acknowledging that the first moments of a crisis or a conflict in Asia will result in the loss of important assets, personnel, and that the United States will need to have sort of the logistics, the resilience necessary to supplement those capabilities and continue on with effectively, fighting this conflict in Asia. So I think that's something that we see. Franz, we are sort of coming to the end of our time. So I did want to sort of ask you before we sort of close out, I did want to sort of get back to the technology a little bit because, I think that ultimately is a big part of the picture here. So there are in this sort of set of things that we talk about as emerging technologies relevant to the future of war. There is there are certain technologies that get overhyped, certain technologies that get underhyped. From your perspective, if you had to sort of leave our listeners with one technology that you describe in this chapter, be it sort of autonomous underwater vehicle swarms or hypersonic weapons or AI-equipped ISR. Which of these do you think is sort of the most sort of underrated or underappreciated technology that has the greatest potential to, and I'm going to be careful here with what I say, to affect the future course of war, right? Be that in positive or negative ways. It could lead to, as you said earlier, inadvertent nuclear escalation or inadvertent escalation more broadly. Which of these technologies has sort of the most potential to really, I think, shock future political leaders and really, I think, directly affect the trajectory of a conflict in its early stages?
I think the most important thing to consider in all of this is that I really don't want to talk about a singular technological capability here, just because what I really want to focus on, or what this chapter is all about, is about the integration of different technological capabilities. And in particular, what I wanted to say in my previous answer was this integration of emerging technological capabilities with so-called legacy systems is crucial. So in one of my scenarios, I take an existing Chinese torpedo and equip it with AI-enabled sensors in order to turn it into an autonomous platform. And I think this is exactly what I'm talking about, and where we need to be really smart in the future about our force structure and about integrating these different capabilities in order to field these platforms earlier, perhaps, than our adversaries, or our potential adversaries, rather. Going through my list of technologies that I'm describing in the scenario, I think I would say that the most interesting one, to me at least, are battle management systems. There is a scenario where I talk about an advanced battle management system. This is actually the name of a system that the United States Air Force is working on, and it might actually deploy, it might get actually operationally deployed in a couple of years from now. And I think what's really interesting here is that this system is really capable of essentially, think of it sort of like as a military Uber app, where you can, as a military commander, see a common operating picture, see your own assets, see what the enemy has, and then also try to coordinate your next moves, or like your next operations from, let's say, this display, like from a display, right? And I think here what I find interesting is that this is specifically, this goes really to the heart of this so-called new or next wave of military technological capabilities that are upon us. This idea of an accelerated operational pace triggered by or caused by having a more complete common operating picture. And because of that, you're just much more aware. You have much more battle space awareness. And because of this, on the one hand, you can really speed up your military operations. On the other hand, you can be more precise about what targets you hit, and also perhaps avoid collateral damage, as it's called, while you're conducting your operations. It's easier to deconflict different operations. So your complexity of operations is increasing, while also, of course, perhaps simplifying it in a certain way if this is all coordinated by AI enabled or AI algorithms, that is machine learning or deep learning algorithms. Of course, again, it comes back to my original point. We haven't solved this yet. There are massive technical problems that need to be overcome. There are cultural problems that need to be overcome before this really becomes a reality. And I'm also skeptical whether we are really going down the right path here when I think about the Russian and Chinese reaction to this new form or this new character of war fighting as propagated by the United States, because they are very specifically working on operating concepts and technologies to really counteract this new form of this new way of American, this new form of warfare. And I think this is going to be perhaps problematic in the long term.
Mm-hmm. Well, Franz, thank you so much for joining me today and walking through some of these issues. I know that many of our listeners, I'm sure, will have benefited from your insight on these issues, and it was particularly fun to sort of geek out over some of the technology issues and talk about some of the higher level questions that arise from many of these conversations about the future of war. I'm looking forward to hopefully doing this soon in person when travel becomes possible. But I really want to thank you for taking the time to come on the podcast today.
Thank you, Ankit. It was great. It was great.
Absolutely. And for listeners, if you like what you heard on the podcast, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you've been a subscriber for a while, but you haven't yet left us a review, please do so. You can do that on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, wherever you get your shows from. It really helps the show. And if you have suggestions for future episodes or potential guests, definitely feel free to get in touch with me either on Twitter or by email. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll be back soon with more.